That's how I used to double my pay. More than what I earned as a CFO. Throughout the entire year.
Can you hear me?
Trying to learn as much as I can.
Hello everyone, welcome. Who of you have heard about the hive before? In the room. How many things about the hive? That's a good number, thank you. So, my name is Pashut Christensen. I'm the Marketing and Partnerships Manager for the Hive. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you for being part of the Hive think tank, a community of practitioners, data scientists, thought leaders, designers, artists, all focused on big data. We organize events, the Hive think tank organize events every
Technology for you.
So we organize events every week, almost now. Next one is the revolution in online education. It has been a long-awaited event in the online education industry, so I really encourage you to register. It's going to be at Microsoft in Mountain View, and I know it's going to fill up very quickly. So you are lucky enough to be here tonight, know about it, and register as soon as you can. It's next week on Wednesday. And we'd like to thank our sponsors, especially Perkins Coie tonight for hosting us. Thank you very much. I would like also to encourage you to tweet about our event. If any one of you is on Twitter, you can use the hashtag #HiveData, and you can communicate between each other. You can ask questions to the speakers and so on. Thank you very much for being here tonight. I'll give the microphone to Ravi, the founder of the Hive.
Thank you, Pashut. Thank you, Pashut. So we fund big data companies. We fund companies primarily in the application space. So applications, use cases that use innovative data science techniques that in some cases you have leverage large amounts of data, large velocity of data, combine first party, third party, public data to create value in different functional areas, marketing, CRM, supply chain, IT, security. We love security, so if there's any people here who are in security, reach out to me, or in different vertical areas, including financial tech and insurance, media and advertising, retail and e-commerce, industrial controls, and the consumer side of it, which is very much focused now on the Internet of Things. So we are looking for entrepreneurs with great ideas. Reach out to us if you're looking to start a company in this space. We're also hiring a bunch of Hadoop people, data scientists, Java engineers for all our companies. So we have 7 companies. We do about 5-6 companies a year. So I encourage you to reach out to us if you're looking for a job. Today, I'd appreciate if you join the conversation on Twitter. Use the hashtag HiveData. to be part of the conversation. I'd like to thank Perkins Coie for hosting us today. And so with that, I'd like to introduce the speakers. So just before I do that, the format today, Hemant and Philippe will give a talk on a very interesting topic around modeling catastrophes, natural catastrophes, man-made situations, and I think oriented towards insurance, reinsurance, global supply chain. We do a lot of events that are around technology, or like last time you came, where our data scientist in residence, Russell Journey, talked about agile data science, where you will see sort of what is very interesting is non-sort of traditional use cases around, most of the people here in the Valley are very oriented towards advertising, e-commerce, sort of very standard things. And so you'll see sort of the use cases that Hemant and Philippe will talk about are very different from what sort of you hear in Silicon Valley. Hemant is CEO, co-founder of Risk Management Solutions. Solutions is the company. Started this company when he was very young, and I don't know if you ever completed at Stanford. He did, and so while he was at Stanford or even younger, he had this idea, and we'll hear more about him, about the company from him. Philippe is from Brittany and is CTO of RMS, and together Hemant and Philippe will present. We'll hold the questions for later, so let them go through the presentation and we'll have ample time for questions. With that, I'll hand it over to Hemant.
Thanks, Ravi. Are the mics on back there? Can you guys hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I need to switch presentations.
Question?
All right, that looks familiar. Good evening, Ravi. Thanks for this opportunity and for welcoming us into your community. We're going to talk tonight about modeling catastrophe risk. I'm Hemant Shah, the co-founder and CEO of RMS, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague Philippe Stefan, the Chief Technology Officer. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem we aim to solve with our technology and a couple of use cases to put you into the mindset of not only the issue, but what kind of business problems we're trying to solve. And then Philippe is going to unpack a bit of the technology on how we actually implement these kinds of big compute models to quantify a variety of very complex natural and man-made phenomena. Now, being a catastrophe modeler, I couldn't resist taking a look at this building, because before Philippe and I set foot in any property, we got to check it out. So we cranked this property into our model. And the good news is that the probability that we have a problem tonight is quite low. The probable maximum loss to this property we modeled to be only about 15% damage to the structure. Probable maximum loss is shorthand for there's only a 10% probability in the next 50 years that there's more than 15% loss ratio to this structure in any single event. So if you got that, please see me after the event and join our firm. So one of the reasons is we're 4.2 miles from the San Andreas Fault, which isn't great, but this is situated on very firm soil, and it's a good structure, so it's likely to fare well, even if there is an earthquake tonight. Now, as Ravi mentioned, this is RMS's 25-year anniversary. We started the company while we were still at Stanford 25 years ago. That picture was taken in the quad. The first model that we put together was quite modest. It was an earthquake model for 3 cities in California, and fit on 5¼ floppy-inch disks. And over the years, we've been pursuing a playbook of developing more models for more perils, for more geographies, for more classes of exposures, and systematically been running this playbook for 25 years and growing our business as a result. The first version of the models we could ship on 17 5¼ floppy inch disks. If we were foolish enough to deploy using 5¼ inch media, it's about 500,000 floppy diskettes, about 600 gigabytes to deploy our software, which is now, as of April, why we're deploying our models in the cloud with a new cloud-native architecture. So we've been at this for a while. The kind of perils we model are a pretty wide range of natural and man-made hazards. We started in earthquakes. We expanded to a wide range of climatic hazards, cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, floods, tornado, hail, winter storms, and then also terrorism and a man-made, we have a pretty significant terrorism risk management and modeling practice. We also model global pandemic diseases and their frequently, the probability and the severity. And we also even model what we call longevity risk, which is not quite a catastrophe, although some of our clients do worry about the possibility for a catastrophic increase in life expectancy, which would have some very significant economic consequences as a result. So we model a pretty wide range of low frequency, high consequence catastrophic events. Just a couple of bullet points of the firm. I won't bore you with any marketing stuff, but we are the world's leading catastrophe modeling firm. We employ 1,300 people, including several hundred in our core R&D and software engineering teams. We're headquartered here in the Bay Area in Newark, California, over on the other side of the Dumbarton Bridge, but we have offices throughout the world. We do business with relatively significant relationships with a few hundred institutional clients. So this is a business-to-business problem we're solving, a few hundred large financial services customers. It's a subscription business model where we license our technology, and the bulk of our revenue streams are for recurring revenue from the intellectual property from our models. And the individual client revenues range from a few $100,000 a year to up to $10 million a year in fees. So these are pretty significant analytics to support mission-critical financial services workflows and decision-making on a global basis. So when we talk about a catastrophe model is not some sort of single formulation. It's not a closed-form equation. It's not one sort of mathematic representation. It's really a composition of many different types of models with different types of modeling techniques, all strung together with stochastic simulation. So if you look here very carefully at an illustration, say, for the California earthquake model, which I use to model the risk to this building, we have what we call a stochastic event model, which is based upon a physical representation of thousands of earthquake faults in the state of California. For each earthquake fault, we characterize its geometry, its structure, and simulate the events that might occur on that fault. We then have what we call a hazard model for each event that we simulate, say a magnitude 7 on this location of the San Andreas Fault with a hypocenter of 4 kilometers. What's the ground shaking distribution? So we use physical models to propagate ground motion through different types of soil regimes to calculate local severity of ground shaking at a site. We apply exposure models where we try to get building-specific detail on the location of physical assets, in this case, their location, the structural characteristics. We have vulnerability or structural engineering models that calculate the damageability or the life safety hazards that might result. And we eventually translate that all into financial metrics of economic risk that support the use cases that I'll allude to. So these are compositions of models as opposed to an earthquake model is one mathematic representation. It's really a mashup of physically based models with stochastic simulation. An illustration here, this is not animating, or is it? Okay, if it was animating, this would be an example of a series of simulations of time-stepping storms across Western Europe. So we model storms, for example, on a very large geographic scale with high-resolution outputs on their flooding, for example. to create a view of flood risk, say, in Europe. If we look at terrorism, just the different forms of output, we have scenario models. So for example, in our terrorism models, we have 26 different types of attack categories we model, from a range of improvised explosive devices all the way through to chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear attacks. We can model the consequences of a scenario or generate risk maps, which is not only the consequences of an attack, it's a probabilistic summation of all the possible attacks, the probability of those attacks, and the consequence of attack to create a risk map for a region, in this case, for Manhattan. And yet the signature output that we generate from our models and what gives the models their utility in the use cases that we focus on is something that we call the exceeding probability curve. So we can generate out of our models an individual event scenario expressed as an earthquake or a hurricane or a terrorist attack. We can generate risk maps, but the signature output is something we call an exceeding probability curve, which is a representation of the probability that there will be more than a certain level of economic loss over a given time period. So for example, all of our models, whether we're talking about terrorism risk, disease pandemics, earthquakes, floods, fires, hurricanes, get expressed as what is the probability for a given portfolio of economic assets. What is the probability that there is a certain level of loss or greater over a given time period? So for example, in this particular example, we would say there is a 1% chance in the next year that this portfolio will suffer $200 million or more of loss from this particular category of risk. We call this an exceeding probability curve, and it's by expressing the risk output in this probabilistic format, we can deliver economically relevant outputs that help, say, an insurance company price an insurance contract, because the expected value of this distribution is the mean loss from a variety of events. We can help people quantify the amount of capital they should hold. So I'm a global financial services company, and I have insurance and financial service exposures around the world. How much capital should I hold in my balance sheet is a probabilistic question. So it might be expressed as I need to have enough capital to be able to sustain the 1 in 500 year loss event. You use the EP curve, or if you're pricing a risk transfer contract, which has an attachment point and a limit, financial structure, and you want to know what is the expected loss in that layer to support a financial transaction with a counterparty, you use these models. So it's this form of output that is consistent across all these models that supports the principal use cases that we work with our customers on. The core focus of the business is in the insurance and risk management space. I won't go through all the details, but we support a variety of use cases in what we would broadly call underwriting, which is an insurance company looking to price an individual policy that they might offer that is exposed to hurricane or earthquake risk. Given a certain deductible, given a certain limit, what is the premium they should charge on that policy in order to have a risk-based rate to support the risks that they're taking on, all the way to an insurance company that might be writing a global industrial account with power plants and factories around the world. How might they actually evaluate that risk? There's a variety of underwriting risk selection type of applications. There's a variety of use cases around portfolio management, which is really managing accumulations of financial contracts. What is the accumulated risk associated with those contracts? How much capital should I hold? How much capital should I allocate to my Japanese business to support the risks from Japanese events, typhoons and earthquakes? And how do I respond to actual events? An earthquake could happen in 45 minutes. Our teams mobilize, publish analytics to the global client base we have, so they can mark to the event what the possible exposures are to report to regulators. There's a whole variety of portfolio management applications. And then risk transfer, a lot of our clients use the models not only to underwrite a piece of risk, to manage an accumulation of risk, but to determine how they can hedge those risks into the secondary market, whether that's an insurance company transferring risk to another insurance company in the form of reinsurance, It's some form of insurance-linked securities going into the capital markets where hedge funds are taking positions. There's a variety of risk transfer business applications that these models support. I'd like to just touch in a bit more detail on a couple of the use cases and then turn it over to Philippe to talk a bit about the technology. One of the challenges that many of our clients face is that they, as global insurance or reinsurance institutions, they are underwriting risk every single day. Every single day they're writing hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of contracts. Every single day they have a certain amount of capital that can support a certain amount of risk accumulation. Policies that they've written in the past are expiring, new business is flowing in through multiple distribution channels of these large institutions, and they are constantly trying to optimize the return on the allocated capacity against these catastrophe perils that they insure throughout the world. So this is an exercise in real-time capital management, which our models help not only measure statically on snapshots, say once a quarter, once a year, when you roll up your risk positions to report to your regulator, but day in and day out, how do you know that you have an accurate, up-to-the-moment representation of your global risk positions so that you can allocate capital to the most economically efficient transaction that you might write tomorrow, and continue to do that without either overshooting your capital, writing too much business, having an event surprise you that you didn't have enough capital to support, or because you're not quite sure what your risk positions are, you hold back and you underdeploy your capital because you don't want to overshoot. So a lot of our modeling support these highly dynamic portfolio management use cases that might play out in a small geography for a small regional insurer, all the way to a large global financial services company writing business in 50 countries across dozens of perils. These models get used not only as a back office occasional risk measure, they're really in the fabric of a financial services workflow day in and day out as risk gets taken on individual contracts, rolled up the portfolio, capital is reallocated the next day, and so on and so forth, to make sure they optimize their positions without overshooting the mark. And then we provide a series of applications and analytics that help them monitor their risks in real time across the underwriters, the risk managers, the executives, generating a number of analytic dashboards to model their risk positions in real time. Another kind of overarching use case I mentioned is around risk transfer. There's a lot of interesting work we're doing right now in the field of catastrophe bonds, which sounds like an odd concept, but there is a growing asset class of insurance-linked securities in the form of cat bonds, where increasingly investors in the financial services, particularly hedge funds and pension funds, are seeing it's very attractive to allocate capital to catastrophe risk because it is an uncorrelated source of risk to the market risk and credit risk they have. They're basically taking a bet on whether the wind blows or the ground shakes. If the economy in China blows up, it doesn't affect the value of those securities, so they can allocate capital to these securities, diversify their risk positions, and balance their portfolios. We did an illustration of one of these. It was quite dark. It was dark. This is a shot of the New York subway system after Hurricane Sandy. So after Hurricane Sandy, the New York MTA suffered several $1 billion of damage to the subway system and transportation infrastructure in New York City. Basically, the subways flooded. And the problem was that going forward, the New York MTA was struggling in order to find enough financial capacity for insurance to cover what could be the next Sandy. So what they did is they turned to us to provide a lot of modeling work to help them essentially construct a parametric storm surge flooding cat bond that would be triggered by the measurements of flooding at different tidal gauges around New York City. We did all the modeling to assess how can you construct an index that would represent adverse outcomes to the New York City subway system and generate probability distributions of what is the likelihood of those index values being triggered and generating payouts. We calculated the expected value to a financial construct and then helped them structure a bond and transfer to the capital markets, triggered by simple parametric measures like 8.5 feet of flooding at the Battery would trigger the bond. And there's a lot of complex financial engineering that goes on, but essentially this kind of modeling work helped structure a very innovative financial security where the New York MTA was able to transfer hundreds of millions of dollars of risk to investors to provide recovery funds following the next disaster. And this deal was awarded Bond Deal of the Year and got a lot of publicity in the Wall Street Journal, among other things. Last general use case I'd like to touch on is supply chain risk. So part of the reasons why catastrophes are quite significant is that the global economy is increasingly interdependent. And so, yes, we believe that catastrophe events are occurring and there's more volatility in the system, but part of what we are experiencing is not Mother Nature, it's the consequences of much more interdependent and fragile systems that are responding to these shocks. So we do work as well trying to quantify risk to global supply chains. These are very interesting problems where you try to construct network models of various types of supply chains and then explore, for example, the Tohoku earthquake in Japan, the Thailand floods, 2011, explosions in Germany, or Hurricane Sandy, how these kinds of events can shock supply chain networks and cause disruption, and then model and develop mitigation and management strategies to those networks. Very briefly, we did some interesting work. This is an actual example of work we did for a major Japanese auto company who took significant damage and disruption, not only to their physical assets, but to their supply chains in the Tohoku earthquake in Japan recently, and construct very sophisticated catastrophe models that can overlay the topology of the network into an analytic model, shock it with different kind of catastrophes, and create a financial risk profile for the network, and develop hedging strategies financially and mitigation strategies operationally to try to manage risk. So I know I'm moving fast, but just wanted to give you a flavor that as catastrophe modelers constructing these models, we're very focused on very business-centric, financial risk-centric use cases, principally in the insurance and reinsurance industry, increasingly in the broader financial services, and with interesting problems like supply chain risk for an increasingly interconnected world. So I'd like to turn over to Philippe to talk a bit more about the technology behind these big analytic and big compute models.
Thanks, Hemant. Just to give you an idea of the scale, the industry we play in is more than $1 trillion in the property and casualty space alone. So there's lots of money that's flowing through the people from Wall Street who trying to help us here.
It's an earthquake. Everybody does.
Earthquake! And the challenge for us is really to build a generic platform that enables us to keep expanding our model kind of without having to build yet another application each time we add either a new model or apply our models to a new vertical or a new use case. So the key questions that people ask across our model catalog are quite simple. How much for this risk? So you come to me, I'm an insurance company, and you tell me that you want to insure your house. I have to price this deal. I have to quantify the risk associated with this coverage. So deal by deal, I need to select and price risk. Second, I have a portfolio of insurance policies, or if I'm a reinsurance company, I will have a portfolio of portfolios. I have a portfolio of catastrophe treaties that are linked to the risk of primary insurance companies' portfolios, right? So how do I manage, on average, the portfolio, the collection of insurance policies that I have? That's the second big question that our clients want to answer. And this is linked to this question of managing capacity. I have a big bag of money, that's my capital. I sign business, but I don't want to overcommit. If I overcommit, the government is going to tell me, you're not an insurance company anymore. This is a scam, right? Now, if I undercommit, I leave money on the table. I don't make use of my capital. So the same way, you don't want to drive without a gas gauge. You want to know how much gas you still have in the tank. You want to have a dashboard that tells you how much more business you can write, and you don't want to exceed what you can. Okay, so that's portfolio management. And last but not least, we want our clients to not just believe the models and let the machine drive their business. We want our clients to really take ownership of their decisions and explore the different dimensions of hypotheses built into the machine. Hypotheses about the exposures, hypotheses about the functional model, hypotheses about our own parent model. We don't want people to just believe us. We want them to play with the knobs and play some switches to make sure they understand what the machine is telling them. Okay? So how do we build this generic system? So how does that work? So using a very simple example, so I have a house and there's an insurance policy here. So express that location, that house, in the system translates to the creation or lookup of a vulnerability curve, a fragility curve. The x-axis here is an event intensity, and the y-axis is a damage. Okay, and when I say damage, it's actually a distribution of damage around a mean with a standard deviation / coefficient of variation. And then what we do, any particular event that would hit the house corresponds to an intensity. I look up the damage from that intensity. Okay, so one event, as in an earthquake, a particular instance of an earthquake hitting this building here, shakes the ground. What damage to this building for this particular event? Okay, once we have that, we create this distribution of damage around the mean. We then sample that curve. So we would take, say, approximately 1,000 samples on that curve. Catastrophe.
How's the conflict with the liability policy to hide?
Any particular loss, that's a simulated claim. I percolate this through the terms and conditions of the insurance policy. If it's above the deductible, there's some check that would be signed. If it's below the limit, good. If it's above the limit, I will pay the limit. And I record this loss. Okay? And then I do this again and again and again and again. Right? So what doesn't change is the vulnerability curve, but we simulate all sorts of events to get to losses. We do that many, 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 many times to come up with what Hemant was talking about, the exceeding probability curve. Right? Y-axis probability, X the loss. Okay? And when we talk about catastrophe risk, it's all about risk that translates to events. Right? So that's why we can do natural catastrophes like hurricane, earthquakes, flood, etc., but also man-made catastrophes, pandemic, and whatnot. Okay? So just to be clear, events are compiled down objects. So we don't call the weather channel or whatnot to see what's going to happen in the next few days. Our models contain tens of thousands of possible events. So that's what we do at RMS. So we don't predict the future, but what we do is we explore potential scenarios, many, many potential futures associated with likelihoods, with probabilities. So, and that's an event. So that's an example of a typhoon that would hit Japan, and this animation here shows, actually with our system it runs a lot faster than this, shows the impact of storm surge in the city of Tokyo, Japan. Right? So one event corresponds to a lot of data. Right? So and I'm only showing the storm surge. That is the water that's pushed by the wind that would flood Tokyo like the Sandy storm surge flooded Manhattan. And an event is not just storm surge, you also have wind damage, and if there's a lot of rain, you might have flooding coming from rivers. Okay, so an event is a lot of data in itself. Okay, so to give you an idea of the scale that we have to deal with. So a typical client portfolio, which is kind of a collection of policies referring to locations as in buildings, about one gig of data. But one model run, so let's say 50,000 events, right, times 100,000 locations, times 1,000 samples in that damage curve distribution that was showing times 8 bytes for a high precision flow. That's 40 terabytes of results for one model run or one portfolio. Okay, digest this for a second and think of a big reinsurance company that's insuring thousands of contracts, as in thousands of portfolios. Let's say 5,000 portfolios. That would translate to 200 terabytes of data that you'd want to store if you want to, if you don't want to be smart. That is, if you want to just run the models and forget, that's what you have to store. So to some extent, our problem is too big for what people call big data now. You can't, I mean, this is super big data, if only because, well, and also because we'll host the entire industry in the cloud. So this is just one client. We'll have hundreds of clients. Not all of them are that big. But you're talking about a lot of data. And I'm talking about just one model run on portfolio. If I'm an insurance company, I want to do several runs. I want to test some hypotheses. I could do 10 model runs per portfolio. So you could easily multiply this by 10 for just one large reinsurance company. So lots of data. So there's a constant tension at RMS between wanting to increase the precision of our models, doing more sampling, more simulation, more events, and dealing with the resulting data. How much should we do in memory? How much should we store on disk? How much of the share of big data technology can we actually use to do our jobs? Tricky problem. So, and it's not only tricky because of the size of the data, but it's also tricky because it's pretty complex. I mean, you can't add risk. So the risk of all of us being hit by an earthquake now is not the sum of our individual risks, right? So as opposed to the technologies that you find supporting, e-commerce, where you count the number of clicks, so you might have bazillions of clicks, but it's all additive. Right? You can do averages, you can do top 10 fairly easily. In our case, you need to have the very granular data if you ask if you want to answer unanticipated questions, right? So non-additive. Also, people want to explore, as I mentioned earlier, different hypotheses. So what if the vulnerability curve, what if RMS is too pessimistic in the north of Europe? What if RMS is too optimistic as to the rate of category 5 hurricanes? So we want to turn those knobs and rerun the models. Right? What if the quality of the data, of the inputs, of the exposure is not good enough? What if on average the insured value was 10% less or 10% more, or the number of flows was actually not accurate, or the construction type was not accurate? And last but not least, we work in a very regulated industry. So we'll have to make sure that our clients' data is safe. We'll have to make sure that any change is auditable. We'll have to make sure that the data stays as opposed to forgotten renewal season or year after year. Okay? In terms of how the system behaves, so this is a very fancy plot that we'll submit to the Museum of Art pretty soon. It shows you that this is not just about parallelizing our model execution framework. So at a high level, you might think, but there's lots of events, there's lots of locations, lots of sampling. It smells like something that you can parallelize very easily. And that's quite true, actually. There's a lot we can parallelize, and we use pretty significant compute grids. At the same time, the larger the portfolio, the more you can distribute. But the more you distribute, the more you realize that you spend less time in CPU and you spend more time accessing memory. And even at like 25 gig a second, accessing random memory, it actually feels slow, right? And you distribute a big job on 10,000 cores, where all of a sudden network bandwidth and memory access all will slow you down. Okay, so this is what I'm showing here. And the little dots here show that for small portfolios, actually the speeds are perfectly acceptable, and you spend all your time in CPU. Okay, so that type of scale, so big data complexity, we can only do a good job if we have a lot of cores available, and we can't afford to have all the cores available at all times in case all our clients want to run their models at the same time, right? So being good modelers, what we've done is we've built a stochastic model modeling core usage. So that's another EP curve that would show that there's a 10% probability that we'll use a little less than 35,000 cores. That we need a little less than 35,000 cores, right? So if all our clients click the analyze button, well, if they do it all at the same time, we need a boatload, of course, right? And this means that 1 out of every 10 years, we need about 34,000. That's how to read that curve. Okay? So the takeaway here is you can do it on your laptop, right? And the takeaway here is it makes sense for RMS to go to the cloud, and it makes sense for all our clients, even if they're really large companies, it makes sense for our clients to syndicate IT through RMS. Our stack, just quickly, notice there's no Java here. For some reason, we still have some Fortran code. We do a lot of C++ for the hardcore analytics. We use C# for the business layer. Our interface is all HTML5, what they used to call dynamic HTML, but really fancy technology, sophisticated visual analytics that support an immersive use case as opposed to like a regular website. We might use ParseStream at some point. We use Vertica today, which is a pretty powerful column-oriented database. And the exposures are stored in Mongo for 2 reasons. One is scale. The other one is we need NoSQL. Sounds funny. We don't want to use relational databases because we want our schemas to be extensible. Right? So today we support a number of lines of business, but we want to extend RMS1 to supporting a lot more than just what we support today. So there's marine, aviation, there are all sorts of lines of business that we want to support incrementally, and we don't want to bring RMS1 down, the platform down, the cloud down, to add one more line of business. So in the future, we want to extend what it is that you can do on our platform. We want actually to build a reference database of stuff that can break. So that's very general, that's very ambitious, obviously. Now we have a reference database of US locations for about 80 million buildings, single-family dwellings, and commercial structures with vetted parameters, the number of floors, construction type, etc., etc. And this is expanding. So I talked about this. We also want to open the platform to other modelers. So remember, it's a generic platform. We don't have enough time. We'll never have enough bandwidth to model all the risks in the world. And we also think it could make sense at times for our clients to have a second opinion. So the platform is also open in that dimension. Generally speaking, we want this to be a generic risk exploration platform, right? And last but not least, we want this platform to be a communication platform. Today, people email data around. It's a big mess. People take database files, clone them, hack them, FTP them around. The data grows and grows and grows. The transfers are slower and slower and slower. Data quality goes down. We're putting an end to this. So our platform is not just all of this, but also something we hope people will communicate through. Okay. Oh,
Team says hi.
says hi. All right. Is it Q&A time?
Yeah, it's Q&A.
Yeah.
We're right on schedule.
Maybe I can start.
Yeah, for I guess.
I have one question for each one of you. One for you, Hemant, is that is there any liability if your prediction goes wrong or the predictability what you are making, like say.
We're never wrong. No, that's a serious question. That's one of the more existential risks that we always go over periodically with our board and our principal shareholder. Our view has been, and it's held up for 25 years, that we manage our liability effectively through our contractual language, and it's important because we do business with a relatively small number of large, sophisticated institutional clients who are capable of understanding the risks of using models. And so we have, knock on wood, managed our legal risk quite well over the years. But it does come up from time to time where, we like to say all models are wrong, some are useful. And so there is a constant need to educate our customers and ourselves not to believe the models too much, as Philippe talked. So a lot of the work is not only contractual, and our legal limitations or our legal liability. We have a team that's awesome at managing that for us, but also constantly giving our clients tools to help them understand the uncertainties in the models, right? So part of the thing is, the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. You just get these kind of autopilot decision making. So we have taken a lot of that to heart, even though the financial crisis didn't affect our class of models. After that, we took a whole action to re-architect a lot of our modeling, which Philippe mentioned, around being able to not only express our view of risk, but provide an environment to express alternative views of risks and characterize uncertainty and stress test the assumptions. So our clients spend a lot of time not only modeling the risk to their exposure based upon our stated assumptions, they also model the risk to the model assumptions. It's another dimension, an orthogonal dimension of risk, model risk. So we spend a lot of time that as part of educating them not to forget that the models are just models, and there's a lot of uncertainty in these class of perils. Actually, that's the resolution of this next slide is not very. This is my favorite slide. Philippe and I being geeks, but so. We spend a lot of time managing uncertainty with our clients, but legally we're completely buttoned up on this and have not had any problem.
No, I was just looking at it and saying that predictability by means is something, but a statement, and if somebody is making a financial decision based on the predictability what you have, then somebody will try to figure it out a way to make you responsible. But
yeah,
I'm glad that
we're still in business.
You see sometimes in e-commerce around fraud detection, where because the liability is limited, where companies are saying, I'll take responsibility for the consequences. So if my prediction is wrong, I'll bear the burden.
Yeah. At the same time, it's important to remember we don't predict. So we give you a model to roll the dice, and we say, you have 1 in 36 chances to get a double six. If you get a double six, can you blame us? You don't get a double six if you play 1,000 times. So there's a nuance between predicting and quantifying probability.
The question for you, Philippe, is, and that's one question for you, is that now across the profiles, like you were talking about portfolio of insurance companies or any companies, but your underlying data for many one of them are going to be same. See, if you are doing an earthquake modeling, right, and you took New York, suppose, or this place, so whoever is going to do that locations and what building falls in, whether that is done by MetLife or that is done by all state, your underlying data is same. Right? So your architecture, do you keep that data as your one layer down than the portfolio, or you always roll up everything for
Yeah,
everybody
that's
separately.
a very interesting question. So, yes and no. So, one, you're right, a building is a building. So if somebody insures a tenant in the Empire State Building, 2 or 3 insurance companies, depending on the risk assessment of the Empire State Building, there's no point in doing it 3 times, right? At the same time, so we don't have the complete database of all things that can break, right? So we don't have a complete database of all buildings in the US. So some clients will have data we don't know about. As a matter of fact, our exposure source database would cover about 60% on average of the US-based reinsurance that we know of, right? So there's some holes in our data. Some of our clients have a view of what matters in terms of the characteristic of a building, and they for industrial facilities, for instance, view it as a competitive advantage to actually have more knowledge than the others about the actual characteristics, right? So, in other words, the data schema that can grow, and some parameters could be proprietary to some of our clients.
So you can extend, because as you are showing that you are getting this, this many petabytes of data, but if you extract it, if you could,
Yeah.
then
No.
then your storage power would be a little lower than.
No, that's right. Well, yes and no. Again, remember the inputs are, I was talking about 1 gig, and the output would be 40 terabytes. So there's a lot more derived data than there is input data. But what's really proprietary or private to some extent for clients are the contracts, right? The building characteristics, that's semi-public.
But your model is the generating data in between, right? So your model, is it different for every, like a portfolio?
No, it's not.
So the model, when they are generating, if you have an input in generating that data, then
Now
yes.
remember, the input depends on the client's contracts. It's not just the building, it's how the damage translates to dollar losses.
I had a question about your slide early on, where you showed
Which one?
the events you sample in the curve of how a certain level of damage translates into certain costs.
Yeah.
Can you bring up the slide?
Yeah.
And I was wondering,
This one?
no, earlier when you were talking about the sampling methodology, way earlier, very early. on.
Your
way at the
Not
beginning.
this slide at the beginning of your
Oh,
I don't have any slides.
let's go back further. I think.
I think
yours?
it's a yours.
Maybe it's not.
Yeah. It's an EP curve, you're talking about that?
I think it's just a stylized EP curve. Yeah, it's just. Anyway, your question. We'll
Yeah, I mean, so.
We'll do the clicking for you and say
Thanks, Philippe.
You can press the
You can see-
slide number and it will come right away. You don't have to do this.
This one?
No, not this one. No, it shows the rising curve of damage, and then you have an arrow of how that translates into a certain financial loss.
Yeah, so that was
Yeah.
that was my mistake.
Oh, we get to see the presentation 3 times.
Better, right? So my question was simply when you say an event, how does that translate into error bars? So if you say something like a certain level of damage, how wide are your error bars, and how that translates into financial loss? So like if a building burns down, everybody inside dies, or if a building burns down, nobody inside dies because they got out in time. But maybe you don't care, maybe you're not insuring the life insurance risks, or are you only about the property risk? To what? Okay, so in that scenario,
Yeah.
do you treat those as 2 completely separate scenarios, or a scenario with huge error bars?
Both. I mean, it's one event, right? So one event will have 3 damage curves depending on what you care about. So say structure,
Okay.
building, the contents, and potentially its occupants. And then for each of those particular damage curve, then you sample. Right? So there'll be uncertainty on the impact of people. There will be uncertainty on the impact on the structure of the building.
Yeah.
There will be uncertainty on the impact of the contents.
Right, so it's a surface, it's not really a single curve.
Right. Yeah. I'm making it look a bit simpler.
I have a question. So, two questions on the business side. First one is a little bit of a follow-up on the other gentleman's question. Have you had an opportunity or anything to share in terms of use cases where you had a chance to test your model in reality, like you had done something and then something actually happened and you could validate how close, or can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think the question for those here is how do you test your models against actual events? And,
What if,
and what's the so what from that, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the way that the whole mindset is that every catastrophe is a learning experience. And so the catastrophes, of course, test the models, but the main mindset and activity is what do we learn and how do we improve the models, and it's an ongoing process. So that's why at RMS we spend, our R&D as a percentage of revenue is more than twice the average for typical technology companies, because we have this ongoing R&D function to constantly be recalibrating models as events occur. Some events we do quote unquote well, and we are recognized for that, like Sandy, which was considered to be a surprise by many. Our customers gave us a lot of feedback and kudos, because while it's an unusual storm, it was in the range of events that we had sampled. We had sampled big, messy storms in the Northeast hitting around that area, causing significant storm surge flooding. And as a result, that was considered a validating event. We had another contrary example is that in the Tohoku earthquake of 2011, we didn't model magnitude earthquakes that were that large off that subduction zone in Japan. And so we underestimated the severity of the event, and as a result, the consequence of the tsunami. And so that was one where it was considered to be a learning event to say we had underestimated the maximum earthquake magnitudes in those types of earthquake faults, and we're upgrading as a result. So every event is a big R&D project in itself, and one of the mechanisms that is that we use that is a good feedback loop is that because we are able to work with hundreds of these insurance companies, when the events occur, they share their loss experience with us. And that loss experience in aggregate, no one company has enough experience to derive reliable empirical data, but by pooling data across hundreds, we train our models. So every time there's an event, we get the data from all our clients, we go through recalibration exercises, and then there's big learning workshops that we go through that go on for months. We update the models, roll them out, and so on, and this loop keeps going.
So as a follow-up to that, if you could, would you be able, depending on your experience so far, are there any certain factors that make a model stronger or more reliable than others? Certain takeaways from that?
Well, there's a good crack at this. So, I mean, separate the hazard from the vulnerability side. So, just to model something that can happen, I mean, requires a lot of science, right? So, we do model the tree falling in the forest, even if nobody's looking. We model earthquakes and tsunamis. We have based on science. We have more than scientific PhDs, and the quality of the hazard side depends on the amount of data we get, and depends on just the quality of the people we have. You know, how good are our scientists. Then there is the impact side. So certainly with a post-event, I mean, you can't measure the probability of an event. Post an event, right? I'm getting my 6, so what? But I can measure how much money I've lost. So the quality of the vulnerability side comes from also the collection of actual experience data.
Maybe one general thing that we've learned over the years is, across all the modeling domains, is to look for fragility in modeling assumptions, meaning small perturbations in some of the variables leading to significant changes in the outcomes. And so part of the stress testing we do is to perturbate a lot of the assumptions and look for surprising changes in the output, because these are highly nonlinear systems, and the probability of having more than $1 billion loss to a big financial services company can be very sensitive to input assumptions across. And so what we do is look for, as part of our model building, particularly if those assumptions are not backed up by a lot of empirical data. And then we try to essentially ensure that we don't have undue sensitivity of fragilities. And I think that's classic lesson learned after 2007, 2008 as well. But we're trying to get better and better at flushing that out in our model building processes, because it's those kinds of things that can cause a lot of big surprises after the fact.
So one last
So
part.
so that's,
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to, so a new model will have a lot of epistemic uncertainty. We're not sure what we know, and a mature model will have typically a lower epistemic uncertainty, both on the hazard and volume.
So the last question related for me is, have you worked with power grid systems for catastrophe?
We have. We've done some interesting work, for example, that I think I know we was discussed publicly with, say, Electricity de France, EDF, including helping them securitize their risk into the capital markets for their big electricity and power grids. And in that case, they also had concerns over their nuclear power generation in the south of France, which is exposed to earthquake risk. So both windstorm, flood, and earthquake. So we have done work like that. It's very complex because in many ways, buildings are simple things. When you're dealing with power grids, you're dealing with the fragility of networks as well, which starts to layer in a combination of the supply chain network kind of use case with the kind of more traditional property insurance kind of use case. And that is an area that we've done work in. Yeah. Yes.
So you have a wealth of information and sensitivity testing and all that is of great value potentially to many other clients that I didn't see you listing. For instance, anybody that is interested in reducing the risk of construction of buildings or of choices around where to locate roads or other things has a vested interest in it, and for that matter, the insurance industry does too. They would like to minimize that. So if there were certain smart things like sensors that could be installed in certain things, or horizontal levees, meaning the use of marshlands or other things to buffer against the sea damage, that kind of information seems like it offers market opportunities for you, and that are also beneficial to the industry that you presently serve. I just wondered to what extent you're pursuing those or doing that right now.
It's that's a very thoughtful question. Thank you. There's always been a tension. One of the reasons, I'd say, one of the reasons that we've been able to take a rather esoteric problem and turn it into a 1,300-person business is because we've made some tough choices at times to focus on certain use cases and not dilute ourselves with a lot of horizontal application of a modeling technology, and focus like a laser beam on really trying to deliver a lot of value to a few number of use cases. That being said, as we've been growing and as we've been thinking more about how we want to keep making an impact, because our it's a pretty mission-driven organization. If you scratch the surface of the culture of the company, there's a lot of people who actually work here because they want to make the world safer and more resilient, and that's why we're able to attract these kinds of teams to work in a private company. We're starting to think more about how we can make a broader contribution. The notion, Philippe talked about the ecosystem, where by generalizing a risk modeling platform, we don't have to be the ones to develop all of the modeling apps. And a lot of the future innovation can come from others seeing problems that they can leverage our infrastructure and our modeling environment to build tools and applications for specific problems. That's one way we think that we can extend our contribution to the ecosystem work. Yes.
Modeling and simulation.
We have the same name.
I know. Alright. Modeling and simulation is used in several different areas of human endeavor. So you're probably using Monte Carlo simulations. That's used in investments. That's even used in medicine. So are you using any open source to grab certain well-established technologies to build your system, or are you building it from the ground up and not communicating with anyone, and not taking any open source technologies that are out there?
Well, there's two questions here. There's an implication that we're not listening to anyone if we didn't use open source.
There we go, the religious debate.
Now, I've been at RMS for 5 years only. I mean, but I spent my life in risk management in the financial industry. I think
So it's the same problem in many ways.
Well, actually, it's not. So grew up pricing derivatives using molecular techniques. What we do at RMS is more complex than what's being done across the financial industry. Go to the most sophisticated hedge funds, you go to Goldman or JP Morgan. What they do is less complex than what we do. There's an almost infinite source of risk that we'll have to deal with, and per risk there's so many different dimensions that are actual hypotheses that people would want to test. You go to capital markets, so there's market risk and credit risk. Market risk, you got stock prices, interest rates, foreign exchange, and that's about it. And there's some very strict and reassuring, simplifying laws of market, like the non-arbitrage clause, for instance, or the assumptions that markets are liquid, that make it a lot simpler. There's no arbitraging earthquake risk. Nature doesn't care. You could have a flood and an earthquake at the same time, and a hurricane hitting and tsunami.
We're a lot of fun to hang out with. Yeah, this is what every day is like this.
So yes and no. I mean, unfortunately, there's not. At times, we have to build versus buy.
Ronnie, how much time? We could go all night, but I mean, I'm full of
Let's continue. Let's get a few minutes.
I have a very quick sort of specific use case question because there was only something like that. You were talking about EDF and power grids and stuff like that, and I was wondering if there's been any discussion, I guess especially in the context of GPS and communications industries, of like geomagnetic storm risk for local areas and that sort of stuff. Just satisfy my own curiosity.
Yes, one of our researchers is very interested in that problem. Yes. Yeah, that was a short. Yes. Yes, and then here. Yeah.
Fascinating talk. It's just a great subject. Where do you see risk being underpriced in the market? I just said Tohoku, nobody really saw it coming, and especially the business disruption as a result, and then you look at when the premiums jump up and different reinsurance companies kind of scoop up market premiums. Similarly with Thailand, similar thing, business disruption, supply chain, and then a lot of insurance firms go broke, and then somebody say like Berkshire will come in and just scoop up amazing premiums. So where do you kind of see in the global market risks being underpriced?
I think there is a systematic underappreciation for Thailand is an interesting problem because there's two things going on there. There's an underappreciation for the concentration of economic assets in industrial clusters, particularly in Asia, where people in the industry will think about their exposure in Thailand, and it's a small country, and then they don't realize that the whole exposure is in 8 industrial estates, like 8 point locations. And so if anything goes wrong, all of the exposure is going to be gone, right? So you have this inexorable drive for economic efficiency, which is concentrating assets in these huge megacities and these industrial estates, and coupled with ever more interdependent supply chains. So you have this problem of these mega concentrations that also are at the heart of very complex and fragile supply chains. And so I think that was a remarkable reveal of two problems in one in Thailand. I think that's a systematic problem, and one thing that we're quite optimistic about is the flow of third-party capital from pension funds and hedge funds into insurance-linked securities is going to create more opportunities for more coverage at more, I think, cost-effective pricing to handle these accumulations, because the pools of capital that can be deployed from those providers versus, say, some traditional insurers, I think will make the markets much more resilient to those kinds of exposures. Because so yeah, I could talk about it, but that's an example of a problem. Yes, actually, yes, you're very patient.
So it's so exciting to see IMS bridge the gap between big science and big data and everyday business decision, and even to public transportation operation. So I just wanted to understand a bit more about how the ways that you help create a more resilient society.
Our
Yeah,
thank you for that. I guess it was an implied compliment. I appreciate it. The theory of the firm, or you might say the big ideal, is that if we can quantify risk, we can provide capital providers the confidence to deploy capital against that risk in ways that are responsible, but yet by enabling them to do so with confidence, they can extend coverage. And coverage creates more ex post resiliency. There's tons of research that shows that societies are much more, they benefit significantly from ex post certainty in financing for recovery. And the data, event after event, where you have disasters with low rates of insurance, lead to longer recovery times for the population. So if we can enable capital providers to extend coverage because they can quantify risk, that will extend coverage, lead to more ex post recovery, and the market mechanisms in place to create ex ante incentives to mitigate risk. So our big ideal is that if we can deliver these kinds of analytics, we can actually put in place the mechanisms to create more resilient societies. And it's one of those big, hairy, audacious things that the horizon never arrives, but we've been at it for 25 years, and we'll keep at it every year. Robbie, how are we doing on time?
Maybe two more.
Two more questions. Okay.
So yeah, in terms of freak events, like you mentioned the Thailand concentration, freak events exposing dependencies that people are aware of, were there lessons learned from the Icelandic volcano?
Yeah, I and my family were in London, and we got caught for some. We actually did some work on that around air transportation. So there was a lot of losses to the airline industry as a result. We did not have that in our models, but that was after that event. We did a lot of work helping understand and creating some interesting financial products for the airline industry following that event. But at a personal level, yeah, I was stuck in a London hotel room with two small children for 2 weeks, so it was a learning experience. But
Yeah, I was doing a presentation 2 weeks later, and I had to learn how to pronounce Yatla Yuka.
Yeah.
Big impact on the farm.
But I was thinking more sort of hidden dependencies of like, okay, it's obviously a travel risk, but it might also be a business continuity risk. Or even if you locate it in Iceland or Greenland. So it's sort of this, the hidden interdependency of systems that you didn't know were related.
Well, joking aside, we have an R&D team focused on what we call system cats. So we've created a taxonomy of classes of events that we think expose systemic risks, and even if we don't have fully articulated models for each of those categories, we use that in workshop settings to reveal what might otherwise be unexposed interdependencies. And these events range in this taxonomy include war scenarios, financial shock scenarios, and the kinds of events we've been talking about here. So we have a framework and a process for that. We can't, by definition, ex ante build a model for things that we don't know about, but we have a methodology we use, and we sit down and workshop with large, in this case, our clients tend to be financial services, large financial services companies, to help them think through what their exposures might be to non-modeled shocks that could expose systemic risk in their systems. So that's a process we go through to augment the specific stochastic models. One last question.
Yes, I just want to follow up on the comment you mentioned that you could have a tsunami and an earthquake and all these things don't happen at the same time. And it reminded me of this presentation I heard by a mathematician, Juan Mandelbrot. He was talking about his book called The Misbehavior of Markets. And he was saying that the problem in measuring financial markets is that you can have, a 10 sigma event, something that should never happen all the time. And that's very difficult to model that. And then, so his premise was that you always have this gap in between what you are modeling and the reality of what's there. So I was curious as to, you just mentioned a comment of non-modeled risks. Like how big, is there a sense of how big that really is? And is there a different type of mathematics that you use to try to address that or look at that?
That's a big question. The models that we generate, we do generate tails on these distributions that go out in some cases to 10 to the minus. We have 1 in 100,000 year events. So there are some really extreme events that we do try to capture, and we have timeline simulation where we have very unlikely years where we get really bad events happening in clusters. So there is a kind of capturing of some of those extreme tales that go far beyond the historical experience. We also, the kind of domain we're working in, which is unlike financial markets, well, I shouldn't say I'll speak to what I know. The domain we work in, there tend to be some constraints, whether they're physical. So, you can't have 5 magnitude 9 earthquakes on the same fault in the same year. The physics don't allow that to happen. Even though it's more squishy, you can't have, in our view, a whole series of certain kinds of terrorist attacks happen because the dynamics of the game theory and the social networks constrain the probabilities of how you might get several large attacks happening all in a row because there's an interdiction cycle. So there are some control mechanisms, some of the probability model, but the question about what is the size of the unmodeled risk has bedeviled us from one of the first presentations I gave was something where I got a question about what is the risk of unknown faults in California. And it stumped me then, and it still stumps me now. So, move on that. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you. Come again.
Yeah. No, I need to buy.
Oh, okay.
I didn't build them up yet.
Free ka khana khana
There's some return need help underneath the food.